Hi, everybody. I'm Jennifer Schlueter, Dean of Graduate Studies at Columbus College of Art and Design, a nonprofit art and design college that has been a creative force within Central Ohio for more than 140 years. Welcome to today's event, part of the CCAD Knows Retail webinar series, featuring industry leaders who share their insight about the retail landscape and what's on its horizon. Before we jump into today's talk and I introduce our speaker, I want to just share a few housekeeping notes. We're recording today's talk so we can share it on our website for those who weren't able to join us. Today's event is in a webinar format. We're all so familiar with that at this point, and all lines are muted and videos are off other than for the speaker. And we will have time to answer your questions at the end, so please feel free to use the Q&A function throughout the discussion to submit your questions. You can also use the chat function throughout to share any reactions or comments. But now I am delighted to introduce today's speaker. David Kepron is a multifaceted creative professional who brings together his background as an architect, artist, educator, author, podcast host, and builder to the making of meaningful and empathically focused, community-centric customer connections at brand experience places around the globe. I just love that sentence.
It's a run-on sentence, though. That's the problem.
It's a beautiful sentence. Community-centric customer connections. David is also a former VP of Global Design Strategies at Marriott International. In that role, his focus was on the creation of strategic design platforms within the premium distinctive segment, which include Westin, Renaissance, and more. David currently shares his experience and insights on a variety of industry boards, including VMSD's Magazine's Editorial Advisory Board, Sign Research Foundation Program Committee, and the Center for Retail Transformation at George Mason University. He also puts his love for learning and having great discussions, which we're going to have today, into hosting the Next Level Experience Design podcast, which brings listeners dialogues about design, architecture, technology, and the arts. In 2014, he published the book Retail Revolution: Why Creating Right-Brain Stores Will Shape the Future of Shopping in a Digitally Driven World. And in 2020, he founded Next Level Experience Design, a strategy and design consultancy where he combines his approach to the creation of relevant brand engagements with his passion for social and cultural anthropology, neuroscience, and emerging digital technologies. It is such a privilege to have you here. Welcome, David. Take it away.
Thank you. And I also get to add that I'm going to be teaching a cognitive science course for retail at the new CCAD Masters in Professional Studies in Retail Design, which is amazing. And so I'm delighted to do that. And I think it's like a time that has come, right? Finally, Jennifer. So that's going to be just a terrific thing to take on in 22. I will now go to the share screen, and let's just click a few things here. We're all used to this by now, so it's not too unusual. And I get to pull up this and slideshow, play from start. All right. Well, I am delighted to be here, and I've been following the CCAD development of the program, the master's program in retail design, for a while now, and it's really going to be exciting. And this is a little bit of a different talk. It's going to be called Jack Be Nimble, Designing Experiences that Adapt to the Unknown. And since we have only about 50 minutes or thereabouts, let's just get right at it. When I was a kid, we got this amazing book one year called The Mother Goose, The Real Mother Goose. And it was a bunch of fairy tales and nursery rhymes and things like that. And what was interesting about the book was it was filled with stories that even today don't make a whole lot of sense. There was the one about Bo Peep, who actually was a terrible shepherd and kept losing her sheep. Jack and Jill, who were great about going up the hill to get water, but not so good at actually getting it back to the house because they would spill it all over the place. Humpty Dumpty, who didn't quite get that a curved thing sitting on a flat surface was likely not to be too stable. And of course, he fell off. And well, we all know what that story was. And then there was this one, which was this terrifying story of babies and cradles being perched up in a tree. And as the wind blows, the cradle will fall and down will come baby. And we know the rest. And there was, of course, the story of Jack. Jack be nimble, Jack be quick, Jack jump over the candlestick. Now, the interesting thing about the Jack be nimble story is that it was first recorded around 1815. And it was used as jumping over candlesticks, that is, as a way to signal good luck. If you were able to jump over candlesticks and not extinguish the flame, you were said to have good luck. So it showed up at weddings and public events in public squares and things like that. If you go from 1815, and you jump forward 100 or so years, the story of Jack has been appropriated by all kinds of people. So Chubby Checker, Jack be nimble, Jack be quick, Jack go under the limbo stick. It's been used for financial planning, companies to as covers and stories for financial planning analysis. Even the Corpus Christi Police Department used a story about a guy named Jack who was neither nimble nor quick and ended up being caught. And of course, the famous interview that some of us may or may not know is with the real Jack by Kermit the Frog, the action reporter. But let's just take a look at that for a second.
And now for another fast-breaking news story, we go to our roving reporter, Kermit the Frog.
I'm getting pretty tired of all this roving, too. Oh, hi-ho, Kermit the Frog here, and I'm standing next to a candlestick, which may give you some clue as to which fast-breaking news story we're here to report on. Yes, indeed, friends, we're here at the site of Jack be nimble, Jack be quick, Jack jump over the candlestick. That's a candlestick, and here comes Jack now.
Hey, Frog, what's happening?
Well, we're waiting for you to act out your world-famous nursery rhyme.
Heavy, I can dig it. What do I do?
Well, it's all very simple. You see, all you have to do is Jack be nimble, Jack be quick, Jack jump over the candlestick.
Yeah.
And the candlestick is right there.
All right, you got it, Froggy dude.
Yeah?
Yeah, let me get a little leg room here.
Okay, folks, here it is. This is a moment we've all been waiting for. Jack be nimble, Jack be quick, Jack jump over the candlestick. Take it away, Jack!
Something else!
I love that. When I found that clip, I just couldn't resist the opportunity to share it. But we're going to rumble down some tracks here, and we're going to do it really quickly and try to cover 3 different things that tie this story of Jack be nimble, Jack be quick to the creation of meaningful places for brand engagements. And the first part we're going to talk about is tech revolution, and that's going to be the quick part. The second thing we'll do is talk about cultural shifts, and that will be, the nimble part. And then we're going to look at the idea of telling stories with light, and that's going to be all about candles and the evolution of light as a tool in the architect's toolbox. So let's just talk about the idea of technology for a moment. It used to be, if you jump from 1815, when that story of Jack be nimble first emerged, let's say to 1915, your general store looked pretty much like that. And of course, now today we have the everything store, which is an image of Amazon's warehouse. The guy who ran the general store might have been like Sam Drucker, who ran the Five and Dime, except now that guy's changed and we have Jeff Bezos and Amazon Prime. Telephones back in those days were actually called candlesticks, but they were connected with copper wires. And now telephones are moving in this direction, which are more about SIM cards and satellites. It used to be that you could go into the cave paintings in Lascaux, France, and see these amazing things that were done hundreds of thousands of years ago. And we've evolved from there to a place now where we're using pixel projection for sort of the same kind of effect. Television used to be pushed up against the wall, and now television effectively is the wall. Now, the interesting thing about this trajectory from, let's say, that 1815 period into the early 1900s and even today is that most of the brands that we love, the brands that we see and use probably every day, some maybe in the course of the pandemic more than others, have actually been selling the same kinds of goods and services for years. We had coffee long before Starbucks, and we had a way to get from A to B way before Uber. We had, clothing way before Amazon or Stitch Fix, and we were staying places long before any of the Airbnbs evolved. And if you happen to have a shaman in your village, you were likely also to know where you were going or where you came from long before we had 23andMe. So the thing that's changed in this paradigm is not the goods or services per se, but the way we've been using technology to get those things to market in the hands of customers. So really we have this interesting world of going from like the Flintstones to the Jetsons in 9 months or less. And I think we'll be going from the Flintstones to the Jetsons, and I'm hoping I'm talking to the right audience in terms of age group here to know who these are. But in 9 weeks or maybe 9 seconds, we'll be shifting that quickly. And the reason for that is that the pace of change is nonlinear. The pace of change is exponential. And so this suggests some pretty interesting things. Like, for example, that a lot of the people who are talking about the pace of change will suggest that around by 2045, we're going to have what will eventually be called, or what is called, the singularity, and where the computing power will surpass the brain power of all humans that there are on Earth. Now, that's pretty amazing, because what it means is that what used to fill an entire room as a computer now fits on the end of your finger and can get lost in a bowl of rice. Or it may still be pretty big in the case of the Summit computer that's put out by the US Department of Energy that can now do 200 quadrillion calculations per second. And we're not even going to get into the world of quantum computing and the Sycamore computer that Google has, but giving an idea of how fast computing power has become. If you asked every human on Earth to do one calculation per second, it would take about 305 days to do what this computer can do in 1 second. Or if you thought of it another way, if you asked one person on Earth to do what this computer can do, it would take about 6.35 billion years, effectively almost half of what we understand to be the length of time of the known universe. Computers are fast, and they're only getting faster, and that will continue to be the case. I mentioned quantum computing, and that will change the paradigm all over again. But what it suggests, though, is that in the next 100 years, we're not simply going to see 100 years of change. We're likely to see something more like 20,000 years of change in today's at today's rate. That's going to be pretty staggering, because what it suggests is that we will be continually moving from large moments in time where significant change will happen technologically, and we'll be continually in the in-between, in this, I call this perpetual liminal space of moving from one reality to another with few or maybe no eddies in which we're going to be able to catch our breath. So we'll be continually moving, and experience will be continually fluid. If you take former executive chairman of Cisco's quote here, at least 40% of all businesses will die in the next 10 years if they don't figure out how to change their entire company to accommodate new technologies. So technology is increasingly part of our world and changing it increasingly quickly. That suggests that we also have to try to keep up. And this brings us to this idea of being nimble. The problem with many of the ways that we approach our businesses or our practices of any kind these days, and maybe even our own lives, is that we're stuck in mindsets that simply just don't apply anymore. Let's take a look at this famous clip by Kennedy.
We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too.
The interesting thing about that clip, which I've always loved, is it's about doing the hard thing. And one thing is for sure, is that change is going to be inevitable, but transformation isn't. And transformation requires a number of things from us that are going to draw on our resources, our sense of bravery, our courage, our ability to deal with the unknown and being resilient in the face of change. And let me use an example. So I'm working at Marriott, and we create a great new Westin guest room with an approach towards owning light as a concept. And we go into our developers meetings who are trying to sell in this room. You open up the door, the ceiling plane in the entranceway illuminates cast shadow and light dappled effect. So it's referencing back to some principles of biophilic design. And we get through this presentation, and I think the room is beautiful. And it's super high tech and really interesting at the same time. And of course, the developer across the table looks at me and says, "So tell me something. Is this thing you're going to do going to give me $1 ADR lift?" And the interesting thing about that question is, and I responded to him, is that, I don't know, because I'm pretty sure that the way that you're calculating ROI isn't the same way that I am. Because my spreadsheet has things like return on innovation, return on creativity, return on novelty, return on experience, and return on emotion. all things that are really difficult to quantify, but increasingly more important in an experience-based economy. However, I said, we have done some research on this, and we know that people will spend $35 a night more to look at the ocean than they will a brick wall. So if I use that as my baseline, I'm pretty sure that this experiential opportunity that'll become your Instagrammable moment and the thing that really drives a differentiator in the marketplace, I'm pretty sure you'll be able to get at least $2 more than you think you will. But what it means, though, is that in times of rapid change, experience might just be your worst enemy. It will be true that the things that you have relied on in the past simply just won't apply because the economy and culture is shifting so dramatically that you won't be able to rely on tradition. So if you take this Jeff Bezos quote, and I'm going to end up, referencing Jeff Bezos a number of times here, he says, in today's era of volatility, there is no other way but to reinvent. The only sustainable advantage you can have over others is agility, and that's it. Because nothing else is sustainable. Everything else you create, somebody else will replicate. So what it suggests to us is that we need to begin to shift our mindset towards being flexible, being adaptive, resilient, and generative, rather than staying in a fixed mindset about, well, this is the way we've always done things, and therefore we can't do. Now, granted, a lot of companies are stuck in legacy systems, ways of doing their practice that are hard to change. But like I said before, change is inevitable. It's coming. Transformation is a different thing. Now, we don't have the time to get into the whole concept of a flexible or growth mindset now, but just know this, that if you were to poll a number of creativity researchers who looked at what that one ingredient was for creative achievement, it was exactly the kind of perseverance and resilience that was produced by a growth mindset, which will become critical in a world where we're going to be in constant change. So just as a basic, conceptual framework for this idea, if you're living in a growth mindset, you're embracing challenges, you persist in the face of setbacks, you learn from other people's criticism, and you find lessons in other people's success rather than looking at them and thinking, God, they're getting ahead of me and I can't stand that. The bottom line is here that if you work from a position of a flexible or resilient mindset, you're going to reach higher and higher levels of achievement because you live with a greater sense of free will in a context where things seemingly are out of control because they're moving so fast around you. All right, so why is that important? Because what it means is that as culture is shifting, we also need to be able to jump higher, jump faster, and maybe jump more often. So let's take a look at this idea of who this new guest is that we're trying to accommodate. They're younger, they're more perceptive, they're smarter, they're more agile, they move fluidly through the world and the experiences. They're highly and deeply involved in social issues and climate-based issues because their world really matters. They are moving towards a world of wellness and well-being. The Global Wellness Institute projects that the well-being industry is a $4.5 billion industry. That's a lot of billions. So the focus is changing on what we want and what we expect from brands. Identity, whether it's sexual identity, whether it's racial identity, are out front and in the common discussion among this group, and they're pushing the dialogues forward towards equity across all types. But this is the world that they live in. They live in this world where we all know this scene. And I love these pictures by Eric Pickersgill because these photographs really suggest something strange about this social paradigm that we're in now, where the devices are the things that are supposed to connect us. Take a look at take a listen to this little clip by Ira Glass from This American Life.
And I have feedback.
Jane looks at her phone. There's a message.
Like someone just texted in a giant group chat, go like my photo on Instagram. It just shows that it happens every single second.
Happens every second.
Happens all the time.
Yep. I got it too.
Yeah.
I have to say, oh my God, this is such a job.
Yeah. It's like I'm a brand, and I am like
you're trying to promote
brand.
yourself.
I'm the director.
And you're the product.
And
you're definitely trying to promote yourself.
To stay relevant, you have to work hard.
Relevance
is a big term right now.
Yeah.
Are you guys relevant?
I'm so
in middle
relevant.
school, we were definitely really relevant
We
because
were so relevant.
because everything was established. But now in the beginning of high school, you can't really tell who's relevant.
Yeah.
Yeah. And what does relevant mean?
Relevant means that people care about what you're posting on Instagram. People want to know what you're doing. People will open your Snapchat stories.
They're only 3 months into high school, so there is a lot at stake right now.
For those of us who run businesses, hire employees, sell things to other people, there's a lot at stake right now. Because this idea of other-rated validation, where I'm receiving a sense of validity in who I am and whether or not I'm relevant, is outsourced to the people who are within my social network. And this really is the cohort of the brand of me. The things that they do and the way that they interact with brands is very egocentric. And to use an example, although I'm not really sure that egocentric might necessarily apply to my son, but let's use this idea and look at his relationship to Instagram when he was 12 years old. So this is his Instagram page from 12. Now he's 19 now, and he's not on Instagram to the same extent that he was then. But I think it points out the obvious for what we now see in terms of how Instagram is being used as a medium for story creation and narrative making and relationships with the world around us. Ben and I would go out to the forest. And I would come back and choose pictures to post to Instagram of the squirrel sitting on the log with the moss and the sunset. And Ben would come back and he'd post things like this. And I would look at him and go, dude, like, what forest were you in? Because I don't get it. I mean, that's not even close to where I was. But these are interesting for me, because he wasn't satisfied with just the thing in front of him. What he wanted to do was to own the narrative of that experience. And by creating content with his digital devices, he was able to rewrite the narrative, maybe in terms of maybe how he wished it could have been lived rather than maybe how it actually was lived. But the projection outward was important, and the creation of the narrative is extremely important. And we'll see why in a moment. Because what will be relevant to them, like these girls were saying in that clip, what is relevant is what is about them. And you might have missed it in there, but they were talking about the things that they produce, and Ira Glass says, and you're the product. And they are very much the product. And their viability in this world is only good to the extent that they keep their product out in front of this group of people who are continuing to validate, unlike people going to stores. So it's one thing for us to talk about technology, but it's a very different thing for us to change that mindset again from a fixed mindset of only talking about technology and what it can do and the AI and the VR, great things, to this world of technempathy, and how technempathy, using technology in the service of relationship building, in the service of empathic extension. Let's take a look at what that might likely mean in terms of how brands think they might want to connect to their customers. Brand affiliation typically has been built on this idea of the inflation of symbolic value over the functional value of goods and services. You know, things were supposed to get your teeth whiter, your clothes brighter. They were supposed to get you from here to there, or whatever the product or service was. So what we attributed to value to those relationships was not so much what the thing did. It was supposed to deliver on those baseline expectations, but it was how it made me feel. The challenge in this world that we're living that is moving so quickly is that when brands are at odds with culture, they begin to lose their value, even if the legacy that they built over years is really strong. So brands with deep heritage histories, especially luxury brands, they're really at particular risk here, because if they are basing their value in their customers' eyes based on their history or this long legacy, this long narrative of how long they've been around, they might likely be in peril with a new culture of experience seekers for whom tradition maybe doesn't matter so much, because their world is very much the now and what is happening in the next now, in the future. So brand experience, what we're seeing is, of course, shifting to a focus on the self, the .me or the me brand, and what it means to be relevant because I created it myself. And also we're seeing increasingly that experiences are being driven or underpinned by an idea of meaning and purpose. What do these brands do every day that make it worthwhile for me to go there, to shop there, or to buy there? Really, really critical. And this is especially true during the pandemic, where we've seen 40% of consumers change brands. Brand switching doubled in 2019, and 40% of this cohort of young shoppers tried new brands. And so their ability to move quickly between brands and jettison brands who don't align with their own personal values some of those things we talked about in terms of their characteristics, from identity to global issues to sustainability issues, they'll move away from them very quickly because they want to connect with brands that are going to reinforce and optimize their sense of self. So what we're seeing is a reversal in this marketplace, away from acquiring coveted items, that had traditional symbolic value, towards brands and their relationships becoming a vehicle for identity. Now, that has always been true to a certain degree. I attribute a certain amount of who I was because I was connecting to a brand, but that is increasing, and it's also increasing and facilitated through the use of digital media that is so pervasive in their world. So conscientious consumption rather than conspicuous consumption will be the consumer's driving force in the future, says Forbes. This, of course, puts some pressure on brands and the things that they want to do, because it means that they'll have to rebuild these new ideological and strategic foundations that allow for these adapting needs to happen, which puts pressure on them to be more flexible and to find ways to meet these changing expectations. And no lag, right? There's this idea that I don't want there to be lag between this experience or this expectation being satisfied and the brand being able to deliver. That allows us to jump again to this next idea, the saying, well, okay, so we have connections to brands and we go to places to engage in relationship with them, but those things we've always understood are really foundational and that they're driven by sensory-based needs. So I want to just play this short clip.
Moment Factory is ready. Ready to connect you with the environment, with each other, in new ways, by exploding the interface. Touch. Please prepare for your next activation. Body.
This sound. This sound.
Portables.
So this is work of some friends of mine at Moment Factory, who I think are just one of the best people in providing sensory-based but digitally mediated experiences. So when we begin to talk about the idea of the evolution of technology, whether it's from the original Jack B. Nimble story of the early 1800s into the beginning of the 1900s, or now into this new period that we're in, what we have to begin to think about is that this all, like I said, lies on this trajectory, an exponential rate of change. But still, though, we have to always come back to the idea about what drives customer experience and where is it? And I will contend always that customer experience is fundamentally in my body and in my brain. And my body acts as a mediator between the environment that I'm in and the experience or the sensory input that I'm receiving from that environment, and how my brain makes sense of that narrative or that story. And what we know for sure is that those places that are able to give us a greater sense of sensorial input, that stimulate more of the senses, like Martin Lindstrom says, that experiences that stimulate multiple senses at the same time can increase brand engagement for as much as 70%. And that's a pretty staggering statistic when you consider what it means to be in a place that engages me physically rather than simply being driven by this acquisition mindset that I had mentioned earlier. So you can get places like this. I'm referencing Jeff Bezos again, and this is the Amazon Sphere's headquarters in Seattle. And it's an amazing place to be or work, because this biodome is a very deeply sensory experience. You can walk in here, you can smell the air, has that humidity to it, the smell that the dirt, everything is alive, and it feels very resonant in our bodies, in mind. The strange dichotomy in this, of course, is that while it's created by this guy, he also wants to sell you things by drone so that you never have to go anywhere, or ultimately he wants to get us all on Mars, which just seems to me to be more an interesting commentary than it is specifically driven at trying to make a point. But we do live in this dichotomous world still of a place that we understand is deeply sensory, but moving towards this other place of the unknown, which we are all trying to navigate. But you can't make every place Amazon spheres. That kind of makes sense. It's a huge undertaking to do that. But you can make smaller places that still drive this idea of being sensory-based, but digitally mediated. So you have things like the Sensix sensory reality pod that through VR and different, from sound and heat lamps and microatomized sense, are able to get the feeling of being in a place, though you're actually in a small cabin the size of a phone booth. But still, though, what we all understand is that those experiences, VR experiences and such, are very isolating. And they don't really fully get to a deep and profound experience at a body felt level. But take a look at something like this.
Cars have windows for a reason. Everybody should be able to enjoy the view, even people who can't.
Sono Anna Rita, ho 36 anni, mi diverte tantissimo viaggiare, stare con gli amici, uscire.
Mi piace vivere proprio nella maniera di Ulisse, conoscere tutto quello che posso.
Devo dire la verità.
Fondamentalmente uno potrebbe rispondere anche tutto.
Mi piacerebbe tanto vedere un tramonto, perché penso che vederlo con la persona che ami sia proprio la cosa più bella.
Il viso di mia figlia, gli occhi di mia moglie, la cupola di Brunelleschi.
La cima di una montagna innevata.
We developed a new language to give people who can't see a landscape the chance to feel it. We created a device designed for the visually impaired that transmits up to 255 levels of vibrations on the car window. The built-in camera takes a picture of the view. The picture is then converted into a grayscale image. Every shade of grey is translated into a vibration of different intensity on the car window, allowing the blind to visually experience the surrounding landscape. Also, an integrated vocal assistant connected to the car's audio system by an online artificial intelligence helps them to put the image into context.
Montagna innevata.
When we begin to understand the power of technologies to allow experiences to happen on a very profound level, things like the field of view window from Ford opens up a whole different world of how we can begin to think about technologies and enhancing experiences. Some things that are often left out of the experience equation are things that drive deeper memories because they're very bodily oriented, very sensorial oriented. So if we begin to think about this trajectory along this exponential rate of change, and we begin to think about candlelight, maybe the one that Jack jumped over, candles and lights and dancing around fires have been part of our culture for millennia. Gathering by fires built community, and we exchanged cultural product stories with each other. And as we move from campfire to campfire along silk trade routes and other trade paths, those stories were shared and reshared. And now that we had the idea of ideas being put together with the exchange of goods and services. And that was, of course, the basis of things like the Agora and places where multiple campfires, if you think of it that way, came together. It's not surprising that you then have architects, who look at the idea of light as being a key component to the built world that we live in. And so you have Le Corbusier, architecture is the learned game, correct and magnificent, of forms assembled in light. Or you had artists like Monet, who stood in the second floor window of a lingerie shop across the street from the thing he tried to paint for most of 1882, the Rouen Cathedral. And he would literally stand in this window from sun up to sundown with maybe 10 paintings around him as women came in this lingerie shop behind him, trying on the finest wares of French lingerie in the late 1800s. And he would get really despondent sometimes because he would write his wife and saying, every day it just becomes more complex. I'm trying to figure out the impossible. He went home and finished his paintings at Giverny in 1883. But the idea that we're using light and is really important. Because it's one of those defining features that has become part of storytelling. And storytelling and public art are directly correlated to the mastery of light as a tool in our architect's toolbox. And so we've moved from this idea of the campfire to maybe Jack's candle, to the gaslight, to electric light, to the theater, to TV, and now to the world of digital placemaking, and where we're painting with digital light. And this is really important because I think, light is a building material. You can't hold it, but we know that without it, the world in front of us doesn't exist. And so if we're going to build with light, what are the stories that we're going to tell in those spaces? And that brings us to this next step in the idea of the candle, and that's using digital light and existing architecture. And we can now paint with light on some of the most amazing buildings around the world, the Sydney Opera House, or the Disney Concert Hall by Frank Gehry in LA, or maybe the Reims Cathedral. But the interesting thing about any of these buildings, with the exception of maybe the cathedral, is that you wouldn't know what happens inside that building. And we have an interesting challenge with us when we start talking about a cohort of experience seekers for whom context is disconnected from tradition. Now, even if you looked at this architecture, you might be led to think, I don't know what's inside that building. But when Rafik Anadol used digital light to paint content on top of those forms, he began to expose the interior of the building to the outside, and he recontextualized this architecture for a cohort of experience seekers for who may not have had any contextual relationship to that architecture. Or it exists on the idea of a bridge. One of the interesting pieces of that clip is the statement that it brings the city together. And we're very fond of talking about data and how we have this extraordinary ability to capture all this data. What we're not so good about is being able to actually manifest relevant experiences from that data beyond recommendation engines. Well, you bought this pair of shoes and other people who bought those shoes also like this. Well, when you begin to think about capturing data like Moment Factory did with that bridge, you begin to think about the use of data in a very different way, something that transforms placemaking in real time. So if you want to talk about being nimble and being flexible and staying ahead of your guests and trying to think about how you connect to them, If you remain in an old paradigm where your job or where your approach to connect to them is by incrementally putting a link in the bridge to connect to them, then as the pace of change continues to accelerate, your guest has moved 3 segments further away. As you build the next one, they've moved now 7 further. And as you build the next one, they've moved exponentially further away. So incremental change isn't ever going to be a way for us to keep in front of the customer. But if we're able to capture data in real time and turn that data into experiences where I physically interact, like my son would interact by creating the data story or the narrative of that walk in the forest and posting it to Instagram, but now do that in real time, we have some really interesting ways to reconceptualize the idea of being flexible or being nimble and adapting quickly to a pace of change that's always moving faster and faster. Those things that we just saw are applications, building as canvas, architecture as the object on which digital content is projected. But what if now we move into this new world where the architecture and the experience is the vessel in which we have digital content projected and we're painting with light in a different way? So whether it's Area 15 in Vegas or Meow Wolf in Denver or Art Tech House in Miami, New York, or DC, these places are rethinking the use of digital content in the making of place in a very different way. Take a look at the inside of another project or Notre Dame Basilica in Montreal. I'm showing a lot of Moment Factory work here because I think they're great. But I've been to this basilica, and I've been to it before Moment Factory did this to the interior. Now, the interesting thing about Aura as a show inside the Basilica of Notre Dame, or even the small clip I showed earlier where people were actively involved with the digital content, they live in the same world and yet they're different. Aura is a show, it's a spectacle. You sit there, you watch, you don't particularly interact. In the previous case that I was showing, jumping and playing and moving, all of a sudden now what we're doing is we're involving people in the creation of the experience. Nothing changes until you change it. I move my hand and the pixels move. I jump on the platform and something happens around me. That direct relationship between me interacting with the experience and me changing something creates a sense of agency. And I don't know about you, but for all the years that I spent in retail, we always talked about customer empowerment. How could we empower the customer to feel connected and to drive the experience further? We now have the ability, as prices continue to come down, as technology fidelity continues to increase, to begin to use these tools more to directly involve people in the making of experience. If you take that one step further, you have someone like Rafik Anadol, who did an amazing thing a couple of years ago called Melting Memories. And Rafik, if you don't know him, is a data visualization artist who does some pretty extraordinary things. And he says what he does is he literally puts the brush inside the machine's consciousness and he paints with data and algorithms. But watch what he did here, and I'll try to talk through it on the other side of this 1-minute clip. Now, what you're seeing is a memory. And what was done in this case was Rafik Anadol recorded brain activity while people were having certain memories, and using algorithms and this high definition digital display, physicalized memories. I think when we get to the place where the data that we share is driven by our bodies and our minds, and we have the ability to, in real time, translate that data into the making of experiences and places, we're in a whole new world. To think of the idea that we could capture a memory and make it physical, to me, seems to be extraordinary. What would a memory of your favorite vacation spot look like? What would the memory of your best meal feel like or look like? What would the memory of the joy you have of getting in that new car look like if it surrounded you? These things aren't far-fetched. They're possible in real time today. Sure, there's lots of issues about technology and integrated systems and things like that, but these things are possible, and I believe they're going to become increasingly more prevalent in our world. All right, so we have a challenge. In our world, we used to build things that would last forever. The pyramids were supposed to last forever. Certainly the Roman Empire believed it would last forever. And the cathedrals, built as a testament of forever, the eternal, and the power of God or some heavenly being, were supposed to represent forever. Except when Notre Dame burns and the roof burns off, wouldn't it be interesting to have actually done what Tim Kobe at 8 Inc. proposed doing, which was to recreate the roof of Notre Dame entirely out of glass, because Tim did all the original Apple stores and he understands glass quite well. That might have taken this building and recontextualized it in physical form for my son, who stood outside of Notre Dame and might have appreciated it to a certain extent, but had no contextual relationship to really understand it on a more profound level. That would be a new idea, to stand in the center of that cathedral and look through that glass ceiling to God, into the heavens. The point to be made here is there's an emergent cohort of shoppers, experience seekers, for whom they're shifting, and it's a large cultural shift. They're shifting away from the appreciation of monuments into the use of moments as expressions for themselves. And that is significant, because we're moving from things that lasted forever into things that don't last for maybe a few moments. And maybe that's okay. If we can be flexible and understand that the fluid nature of experience is something that we have to begin to be more comfortable with. I kind of see it as this idea of this new trend of unfinished cakes, that is not too finished, but that's okay. It might be actually a kit of parts that you use and reuse and recombine in different ways, kind of like Lego or erector sets from my childhood games. Or maybe the idea of pop-up shops, now we know, are not just pop-up shops that are here and gone. Maybe they're continually changing, and that's the paradigm that we begin to live in. Maybe we begin to really embrace the idea that retail places and experience places are about theater, and set changes are important. And theater doesn't happen unless you have the co-opting of experience, the relationship between the actor and the audience. If the audience isn't there, it's called a rehearsal. If the actors aren't there, it's called intermission. And the story isn't told without both those people coming together and collaborating in the making of experience, which is extremely important. And maybe what we have to understand is that we are on this trajectory of jumping over candles, thinking that they're just going to be giving us or affording us good luck, to understanding that stories are told with light. And that what we need to really do is create strategic structures, allowing for the opportunity to co-opt the writing of this narrative, because that's what my sons would like. And the people coming behind them are so used to creating narratives and stories that express who they are. In the end, I love this quote: "The future does not send messengers. Everything that'll happen tomorrow is a result of the creativity of today. Change and the speed at which it occurs demands more and more creativity, more innovation, more courage, more enthusiasm to accept the new without fear." It's important to get the idea that change, and the kind of change we're going to be under, will be continual. But innovation isn't made by incremental change. Sometimes we need to make big leaps, and maybe they're big leaps of faith, and you have to make those. So if you take this idea of Jack B. Nimble, what I think it suggests is that we're going to have to jump higher, we're going to have to jump faster, and we're likely going to have to jump more often. Because when you're standing on the edge of uncertainty, You might just have to do what Ray Bradbury suggested, which was jump off the cliff and build your wings on the way down. And with that, I say thank you.
I'm going to also say thank you, David. That was extraordinary. And yes, indeed, as Bevan is saying below in the comments, provocative. I want to open this up to questions from the folks who are here in attendance, if they want to follow up on some of what they're learning from David today. And I'm going to kick that off with a question of my own that is maybe a little self-centered, but that's who we are. It's my brand right
It's
now.
all about, it's about, you're the me brand, right?
No,
So
I am the me brand.
You're perfect.
So what I am really struck and moved by is the way that you are, as someone who has worked in retail and hospitality and is an architect, turning towards these large experience design firms like the Moment Factory, or referencing out to theater making as a way of understanding how brands might grow and become more courageous in the ways that they interact with consumers who are interested in owning not the thing, but the experience. And I'm wondering if you can talk about what that means within your own field. Like how is it that retail designers are stretching in these directions today?
You know, it's interesting, I think when we talk about experience, and I probably said this for a while now, in the 20 years that I spent in designing retail stores prior to going to Marriott for 4.5 years, we were always talking about experience. I don't think I ever met a client who, in the middle of designing a retail store at the onset, would say, I got an idea. Let's develop a terrible experience. Let's create a store where you can't really navigate the assortment. The lighting's not very good. Oh, and we'll hire people who really don't like other people. And we'll make something really expensive, like blow it out, right? Now, ironically, a lot of retailers do all that stuff anyway. But we've always talked about experience. I think the thing that we're now discovering is that because we are, I think, moving from this idea of acquisition, you know, this conspicuous consumption model into this conscientious consumption, which I remember Christian Davies did a great session at IRDC years ago on that very subject, which was, I think, rocked most of the people who were there. It is true. And I think we're looking to those experiences to drive more purpose and drive more meaning. And so the way you get there, are those experiences that I just showed from Moment Factory for everybody? No. I mean, are they expensive? Sure. Can you make an argument for how do you generate ROI on that? And what's the CapEx on that? That's a whole other issue. Shifting away from that as a way not to do it, to thinking about it's not a CapEx, it's an operational expense. And when you begin to rethink and frame that discussion, it becomes different. So I think it's just a set of tools that you bring to the game that have changed. I don't think the baseline motivation or end game is any different. I just think now the tools you are using are different, and we now have them in greater quantity at lesser cost now. And that'll be like everything else, you know, like the thing that fits on the end of your finger, right? Used to fit in a room. Well, the costs will continue to drive down. And then what will only be the limitations is our ability to think beyond the traditional, think beyond the things that we've done, maybe think that crazy thought. And I think that requires, maybe within corporations, a set of people who are charged with that. Sit in a room, get those people who think crazy thoughts to do their thing, and we'll try to keep the ship floating over here, because we can't take huge change because we just don't have the ability to change all the infrastructure that we've surrounded. So I think if I could just close this with the idea of experience, those brands who are smaller, those retailers who are smaller, and I think the industry is going that way. It certainly is in the hotel world, where bespoke or boutique, that's not the word we use anymore, but those, you know, unique experiences are becoming more prevalent. Why do people love Airbnb so much? Well, because it's not like anything else. And so I think experience is a baseline. It's the tools that you use, and we just happen to have really, really cool ones now, and we'll continue to have them into the future.
Does that present a kind of push-pull, though, between what's moving towards a sort of the smaller, more individualized experiences, the sort of more individualized brands, and the spectacular investment that this kind of work might require?
I'll use Moment Factory as a great example again. Amal Hazelton, a friend of mine there, had that same sort of argument about spectacular and the type of CapEx that you're going to have to do that. You might have told the Basilica of Notre Dame that this was going to cost a lot of money, but they made 10 times the amount of money in ticket sales, which the Archdiocese has really liked a lot as an idea, right? But again, I think it's a question of scale. And I think you're always working in the context of scale. And I'll go back to that one idea that I had before, which is this idea of technempathy. It ultimately doesn't really matter how big it is, how spectacular it is. What matters is whether you connect with it, whether the thing that you're doing is a mediator for bringing people together or bringing people together closer in relationship with the brands that they're working with. And that can be very, very small things. You know, it may be the app on your phone. Or it may be a fully immersive experience that you go and love being in because it's just captivating and spectacular. But so I don't know that size matters so much. It's more like, you know, the motion on the ocean, so to speak, you know, which, you know, yeah, it's not the size of the ship, right? I mean, and I really believe that. I think, you know, you can do small things that still drive deep memories and profound experiences because they've been thoughtful. And you've been tapped into really getting on the empathy side of this technology equation, which is trying to understand how is this use case going to drive deeper engagement and deeper relationship.
Yeah, I think that's so inspiring. Here's another question that's coming in. In your past experience and comments regarding your ROI is different as a creative, did you have success in pushing the ROI plus ROC plus ROM plus ROE to senior leadership? And how can we better connect them emotionally to the memory emotion of what we are designing?
The hardest part of this equation is finding inspired leaders in circumstances where decision-making, and I might be heretical by saying this, is decision-making is not being driven by shareholder value, right? When you're responsible outside of your own sort of fascinations and the people who you're working with to a larger group of folks who are funding your business, it becomes much more difficult because I think the metrics still by which they determine the value of something aren't the same. So the straight answer is it is always a challenge when you're working in the larger corporate structures. It's much easier when you're working with more nimble and smaller companies because they are often not responsible to the same extent, let's say, to larger financial or financiers, right? Stockholders. And bottom line is it requires visionary leadership. And I don't want to suggest that, well, let me suggest that there are lots of great visionary leaders out there who are willing to do that, actually live the Ray Bradbury quote, right? Jump off the cliff and build your wings on the way down. That's scary as hell. Certainly for shareholders it is. But I think you have to do that. And I'm going to say, hope that your wings are built before you hit terminal velocity is, I guess, what I can say. I know it's a great question, and the straight answer is that it's a yes and no, a yes and question. Yes, it's worked in some cases, but more often than not, I think no, because I think we're stuck in traditional ways of thinking about things, and that's harder to change. That's harder to transform that mindset from a very fixed way of believing that things have to be. And I think all of us have had to live that world in this past 18 or so months, right, where it's been very unclear about what's coming next. And that's, for me personally, the hardest thing to do, because I want the path and I want it structured and I want to know where my milestones are and how I'm going to hit them.
I love it. I think that's a perfect place for us to put like a semicolon on the end of this sentence, not quite a period, because before I go, I want to share a couple of announcements. And that is, if today's talk resonated with you, and if you want to think about ways to build those wings on the way down, you may want to consider CCAD's new Master of Professional Studies in Retail Design. It's a first of its kind program, which David is wonderfully going to be teaching in. It launches in January 2022, poised to have big impact on the field, and it welcomes students from a variety of disciplinary backgrounds: architecture, theatrical design, fashion, hospitality, more. Also, if you enjoyed today's lecture and you want to share it with a friend who wasn't able to attend, we'll have a recording available in the coming days. And if you're interested in more content like this, please check out the upcoming webinars in the CCAD Knows webinar series, which I'll also drop that here into the chat. And you can learn more about this program and this way of approaching the synthesis of design fields. Thank you so much, David, for the talk. I really appreciate it.
Welcome, pleasure.
And everybody have a great rest of your day.